In a league where $100 million signings dominate the headlines and blockbuster trade deadline deals consume every sports radio segment from coast to coast, the transactions that actually reveal the most about a front office's competence happen in complete silence. No press conferences, no social media eruptions, no ESPN breaking news alerts interrupting your afternoon. Just a quiet entry on the transaction wire that most fans scroll past without a second glance. The Steward Berroa deal is exactly that kind of transaction, and it is worth stopping completely to understand what it actually communicates about both organizations involved, because the intelligence embedded in a move like this tells you more about how a front office thinks than any splashy deadline acquisition ever could. Let's build this from the ground up, start in Milwaukee, because the Milwaukee side of this transaction is where the real organizational story originates. The Brewers front office made a decision that represents one of the highest conviction moves a front office can make in modern baseball. They extended Cooper Pratt before he played a single major league game. That is not a cautious, wait-and-see organizational philosophy. That is a declaration. It says that the internal evaluation of this prospect ceiling is so high, and the confidence in his developmental trajectory is so complete, that the organization is willing to commit guaranteed money before the player has produced a single box score line at the highest level. Those decisions carry organizational weight that extends far beyond the contract itself. When you extend a prospect pre-debut, you're sending a message to your entire player development infrastructure that the work being done in the minor leagues is being watched, valued, and rewarded. You are telling every prospect in your system that the path from development to organizational commitment runs through demonstrated skill acquisition, not just through surviving the roster construction chaos of 40-man bubble. But the commitment to Pratt created an immediate mathematical problem. The 40-man roster is not an elastic resource. Every spot on it represents a deliberate organizational choice, and adding Pratt to that protected list required removing something else. That something else was Steward Berroa. The Berroa designation is worth examining honestly rather than just accepting the transaction wire language at face value. A 26-year-old outfielder going 0 for 5 in a brief major league stint is not a player who failed. He is a player who occupied a roster position that the organization needed for a higher priority asset. The distinction matters because how a front office treats the Berroas of the world, the players who serve a temporary organizational function and then get moved when the geometry requires it, reflects the clarity of the strategic vision driving roster construction decisions. Milwaukee did not designate Berroa because they concluded he has no professional future. They designated him because Cooper Pratt's organizational priority required a 40-man spot, and Berroa's current contribution profile did not justify holding that spot against a prospect the organization has already financially committed to developing. That is cold arithmetic. But it is honest arithmetic. It is the kind of decision-making that keeps a roster clean and a developmental pathway unobstructed. The cash consideration attached to the trade represents Milwaukee converting a roster inefficiency into a financial asset. Berroa had value to someone, specifically to a veteran-heavy contending organization looking for affordable depth insurance, and the Brewers captured that value rather than simply releasing him and receiving nothing. That is exactly the kind of transactional discipline that separates organizationally sophisticated front offices from ones that leave value on the table. Now, pivot to Philadelphia, because the Phillies side of this transaction reveals an entirely different but equally sophisticated organizational logic. Dave Dombrowski operates a roster built around premium financial commitments at nearly every significant position. Harper, Turner, Schwarber, Nola, Wheeler. The financial architecture of this team reflects a championship mandate that demands elite production at the top of the roster construction hierarchy. But elite production at the top creates a specific vulnerability at the bottom. When injuries strike, as they inevitably do across a 162-game season, the depth behind those premium commitments determines whether the roster can absorb the damage or whether it collapses under the weight of a single disabled list placement. Outfield depth is a particularly sensitive area for a roster carrying this many veteran commitments at premium salaries. The cost of acquiring a legitimate major league outfielder through free agency or a significant trade is prohibitive for a team already operating at luxury tax altitude. The waiver wire provides one mechanism for adding depth, but the waiver process is competitive and unpredictable. A player with any meaningful organizational value can be claimed by any of the other 29 teams before a specific organization can secure him. Paying cash considerations to bypass that uncertainty is a strategic purchase of certainty. Dombrowski paid a defined cost to guarantee that Berroa entered the Phillies' ecosystem rather than risking the waiver gauntlet. For an organization operating on a championship timeline, where an outfield injury in July without adequate depth backup could genuinely cost wins in a tight wild card race, that certainly has a real and calculable organizational value. The Yonio Curette designation on the Philadelphia side completes the transaction picture and demonstrates the same 40-man roster discipline that Milwaukee displayed in designating Berroa. Curette represents a category of player that every organization carries in quantity, a fringe pitching prospect who provides developmental depth and organizational flexibility, but who does not project as a high-probability major league contributor at the level that justifies a protected 40-man spot when a more immediately valuable asset becomes available. Designating him to absorb Berroa is not a statement about Curette's long-term professional prospects. It is a statement about current organizational priorities and the mathematical reality that a 40-man roster has exactly 40 spots. The Phillies traded a fringe pitching prospect's roster protection for outfield depth insurance. That exchange reflects a clear-eyed assessment of where this roster's vulnerability currently sits and what category of asset addresses that vulnerability most efficiently at the lowest possible cost to the organizational depth chart that actually matters for the championship timeline. That is not a glamorous decision. It's an operationally correct one. Zoom out and look at what this transaction communicates about both organizations at the macro level, because the aggregate of decisions like this one determines organizational competence far more reliably than any single blockbuster move. Milwaukee is executing a deliberate competitive rebuild around a foundational defensive infield prospect they believe in enough to financially commit to before his major league debut. The Berroa designation and the cash conversion represent the organizational hygiene required to keep that development pathway clean and financially rational. Every move supports the strategic architecture. Philadelphia is using its financial advantages not just at the top of the roster, where the big contracts live, but throughout the organizational depth structure, where cheap, controllable depth prevents a single injury from cascading into a competitive crisis. Paying cash for Berroa is Dombrowski acknowledging that the cost of depth insurance is always lower than the cost of going without it when an injury inevitably arrives. Two organizations with completely different competitive positions and completely different strategic mandates, each executing a transaction that serves their specific organizational logic with precision and clarity. Neither move will appear on a highlight reel. Neither will generate a single moment of fan excitement. Both reflect exactly the kind of front office competence that championship organizations require at every level of their decision-making structure. The transaction wire never stops moving, and neither does this war room. Drop your analysis in the comments. Does the Phillies' approach to building depth behind their veteran core give you confidence in the organizational infrastructure supporting this championship push? Or do you see gaps in the roster architecture that moves like this one cannot adequately address? Bring your most detailed evaluation. Slam that like button for the deep organizational intelligence this channel delivers on transactions that everyone else ignores. Lock in your subscription because the moves that matter most often happen in complete silence, and you need to be here when they do. The depth chart always tells the truth.